But, you know, I got into 5 stores in Brooklyn, and then I couldn't. It was too early. Driving past all these towns.
So I'd just like to draw your attention to our beautiful sound system. It's a new toy. This was delivered to the Dutchess County Historical Society yesterday, so this is our first field test. And because of that, I of course have to point out the man in the back of the room. If you wouldn't mind standing, Bill, that's Bill Jeffway, your Dutchess County Historical Society Director. Bill is really the brains of the outfit between him and I. He does all of the technological stuff, but I couldn't quite get him on the hook to do the technology for this one. So I'd also like to introduce the Deputy Town of Red Hook Historian, Emily Major. Your hometown hero. Which of course means I'm sure that the presentation will run flawlessly, but if it didn't,
it's her fault.
That's what happens when you're a county historian. No matter what happens, you still get blamed. But before we go any further, I'd like to invite Beth Jones to have a few words on behalf of Historic Red Hook and our sponsors and vendors. So Beth.
I'd just like to first, oh, this is a hot mic. So I just want to first welcome everybody to the historic Elmendorf Inn. It is the oldest commercial building in the town of Red Hook. And I don't know about you, but there's a lot of us that have been around for a long time, and longer than me, of course, but we just love this place and we love to have events here. So thanks for being here, and I just want to acknowledge the vendors that we have here this evening. So in the tap room, if you haven't yet, there are tastings from Hudson Valley Distillers. They're up in Claremont, which is just a few miles north of Red Hook. And also Towsey Winery is here, and they're also across the street from the distillers. And then we also have H2O. Thank you. And Alex is in the back. Thank you, Alex, for being here. And Alex is here. He's from Lebanon, New York, and he has an amazing soda that I discovered last month. I was on my vacation, and we ran into him, and we're like, oh my gosh, you must come to our event. So he's with us, and he has an alcohol-free soda that's made from hops, and it's extraordinary. So please feel free to take advantage of those tastings. The other thing is we have tastings, or had tastings, from a few local restaurants. We're kind of getting down to the last of it now, but we have Flatiron Steakhouse, which is in the center of town, represented. They have a vegetarian couscous thing happening in Cucumber. And then we have, from Mercado, we have some very spicy, what do you call that? I don't know, bruschetta, right, bread with these great fresh garlic and tomatoes, so be careful. And then we also had, I think they're all on now, some tacos from Modern Taco, which is also here in town, and all fabulous restaurants. So if you're new to Red Hook, or if you've been around Red Hook for a while, please go have great food at all those restaurants. They do a terrific job. And if you're not from Red Hook, hang out and check out our fabulous town. That's what I have to say. And we also, in case anybody's interested, we do have memberships to Historic Red Hook, very recently priced. We have envelopes in the middle room, and Susan Simon is playing some early tunes. Also, while she's serving wine in the tap room, so thank you, Susan, very much. And I think I didn't leave anybody out.
About Hard Scrabble Day next week.
Okay, next week, Hard Scrabble Day on Saturday the 16th, is that correct? And here at the Elmendorf, we're going to be serving hot apple pie a la mode, homemade by many local fabulous bakers in Red Hook, as well as we're going to have farm animals for the kids, and apple bobbing, and anything else I missed? Just fun and games from 11 to 4.
Bard mobile van.
What did you say?
Bard mobile van.
Oh, right, thank you. The Bard mobile van will be here doing, what kind of histories are those?
So oral histories, and you could bring any sort of photographs from it, scanned, digitized, and tell whatever you want. So,
Yeah. Share your history of Red Hook, whatever you got.
right.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Beth.
Yep.
Thank you for the audience participation. There's always opportunity for audience participation through this presentation. It's very informal. It's a little bit of a Laurel and Hardy routine. If you've seen those, you'll see a little bit of back and forth. Which one's Laurel, which one's Hardy? That is up to us to discover this evening. For those of you who've been to the series so far, you know that our 2017 Dutchess County Historic Tavern Trail is focusing on Prohibition and temperance, because they are flip sides of the same coin. Temperance takes us all the way back really to the late 18th century during the Great Awakening, which was a great surge of religious fervor, and part of that was generally an outline of alcoholic consumption in congregations. And we've seen at other stops along the trail this year, particularly in Dover and also in Millbrook, that tradition of the church being involved in the temperance movement goes way, way back, specifically here in Dutchess as well as nationally. It got an additional shot in the arm in the mid-19th century, the 1850s, when the Women's Christian Temperance Union movement began, which gathered strength and is in fact still around today. You'll perhaps see more halls than you will see actually active groups, but they're still very much a force and still also on the global scale, if you will. And of course, all of that eventually led to Prohibition. Prohibition is passed in November of 1919. It lasts all the way through 1933, when the 18th Amendment is revoked by the 21st Amendment, if I do math correctly. Historian, not a numbers guy. But during that period in time, we have the gangster era, we have the Untouchables, all of this other crazy stuff. You'll hear a little bit tonight about why we got to Prohibition. Emily's got some fantastic material on that, but nationwide, this was the result of arguably over a century's worth of campaigning by the temperance movement. So you talk about really far-sighted preparations. But by the time that the major vote came for Prohibition in the teens, all the way up to 1919, there were all sorts of statistics being thrown around. It's the scientific age. You want to prove whatever you say with numbers. Of course, we can't verify these, but one of the more outstanding ones that's caught in my mind is that up to a third of the male working population in the United States was either too drunk to show up to work or too drunk to perform their jobs once they did show up. That was a figure that the temperance campaigners, who were known as the Dries during this period, those who fight for the repeal, well, first they oppose Prohibition, and they fight for the repeal of it, are called the Wets. But that was one of the statistics the Dries threw around. I know various scholars who've tried to substantiate it, but it certainly is pretty shocking. Now, when we come to Dutchess County in particular, we've seen a couple of themes that have emerged throughout the series. So the first one of these is about the people who were caught in the net of Prohibition, of those Prohibition agents. And you really have two classes, and you'll see that reflected tonight. The first is just common people who keep doing what they've been doing. So Prohibition happens, they don't really see that it necessarily applies to them, right up until the point where a deputy sheriff, a state trooper, or a federal agent shows up and informs them that they are in fact transgressing the law. The other half of that equation, in terms of people who are caught up in that net, are professional criminals, normally representatives from organized crime, both out of New York City and also out of New England. Especially in Eastern Dutchess, we've seen a lot of evidence of organized crime groups from Connecticut and Massachusetts operating out there. The other thing that we see that is reflected in that, of course, is what exact kind of activity is going on. And this ties in with the economy of the county at the time. Dutchess was a largely agricultural county still in the 1920s and 30s. You had a relatively booming, and relative is an important word here, dairy industry in Eastern Dutchess. You had a lot of agriculture up here in Northern Dutchess, but the farmers were on hard times due to various and sundry measures, from supply and demand to tariffs. The price of agricultural produce had pretty much gone through the floor. So if someone drove up to your house in a nice shiny black car and said, "I'd like to rent your barn, here's a suitcase with $8,000 in cash," you're probably not going to ask any questions. So as you'll see tonight, some of the operations that are busted are kind of mom and pop things that the locals are doing. But the other thing that you see here in Dutchess, and it's best seen today at Dutchess Spirits, which is going to be our next and last event on October 13th, are actually professional level distilleries that have equipment to make thousands of gallons of distilled spirits a week. They're run by professional distillers who've been brought in from out of state. That's one of the ways you can tell that it's an organized crime bust, is They list names of the people who were taken on the side, and addresses in New York City, addresses in Hartford, Connecticut, that sort of thing. And then the final big thing that we see is in terms of enforcement. And of course, when Prohibition comes through, this is a federal act. This is an amendment to the United States Constitution. It also has other federal enabling legislation like the Volstead Act. But it falls, there's no real set out system for how local, state, and federal authorities will enforce this. So they're all expected to do so, but they all tend to do so in different ways. And as you move forward through time, you see that the feds are increasingly shouldering the burden of enforcing prohibition. The state troopers are spread extremely thin, and if you happen to be apprehended by a constable of, say, the town of Red Hook or a Dutchess County Sheriff's deputy, the odds are that they are not going to send you to the Federal Prohibition Board. There's one that sits in New York City, and there's one that sits right across the river in Kingston. There's also a commissioner in Beacon. So theoretically, if you're caught running a still, if you're caught selling liquor, you should be turned over to the feds, and you don't even really get a trial. It's more or less an inquisition in front of one of these commissioners. Deputy sheriffs don't do that. They throw you in front of the local justice of the peace, and depending on how bad your violation is, you might end up in a county court. Now, what is that going to do? They're not going to send you to federal prison in Atlanta, for example. They may give you 10 days in county lockup, fines, all of this other sort of stuff. We don't have examples of it tonight, but in some of our earlier programs, we've actually seen newspaper accounts where Dutchess County judges are lambasting these people who are caught running liquor and other illegal rum and whatnot, saying, you're lucky that you're in front of me and not in front of a federal judge, because you'll spend 6 months in the Dutchess County jail instead of who knows how long in Atlanta. And for whatever reason, they were sending a lot of these people who were caught by the feds south to serve time. So without further ado, keeping those themes in mind, I'm going to turn things over to Emily to talk about how things developed up in Tivoli. This is where you want to have 3 hands, right?
Exactly, just a spare. So, as Will was saying, in the mid-19th century,
You're going to need to hold that closer.
The conditions were really, really bad, and various temperance organizations were formed, the WCTU and the Sons of Temperance, and a whole host of them. And there were, the Sons of Temperance, also the Daughters of Temperance, and the Children of Temperance, all of it. And Maggie Newton Van Cott over here was the first Methodist preacher woman who she was enlisted by the Sons of Temperance, and she went to Tivoli in 1841, and she camped out there for 4 weeks and managed to convert 60 people to sobriety. So there was a bit of a victory there. And you see from the quote that it was just not a good scene. And apparently it didn't take her efforts. So it sort of continued, and this is a scene from about 1913 when Tivoli was known for boxing, children's boxing matches.
Your 2 stars in the middle there.
2 stars in the middle, actually, and grown-up boxing matches as well. People would come from New York City up on the train, and the mayor, or then the president of the village, who you can see in the boulder in the back on the left, Patrick Moray. He actually ran several saloons while being the president of the village, and he had annual clam bakes from 1903 until about 1920, where the newspaper accounts say that about 1,200 people would come, men, from Albany, from Poughkeepsie. It was all politicians. He was also the head of the Dutchess County Democrats. And he would throw these clam bakes that were catered, and it was just multi-day affairs where he would make friends. And so he was pursued by the Law and Order Union, which was run by a really shady character. His name was Sergius Rees. And Sergius Rees was sort of a, I don't know, say like sort of a proto-CIA.
Proto-CIA, really sketchy guy. Don't want your daughter to bring him home for
Absolutely
dinner.
not. So he was this guy, he was born in Denmark, but raised in northern Russia. And for a time, in the early 20th century, he's running the Law and Order Union, and he manages to bring charges against Moray and two of his brothers for selling booze on Sundays. And then he tries to have Moray removed as the president of the village for, I think it's malfeasance, maladdiction, all sorts of bad things. And Moray says, you know, that's fine, I'll step aside. And the tenor of the times was such that somebody else did step forward and say, well, I'll run, but I get to appoint two trustees. Which, you know, trustee is an elected position, so that fell apart, and Moray ended up being elected again. So well into Prohibition, he's running the village and his saloons. So
That's not a conflict of interest at all.
I don't think it's a conflict. And at the same time, the mayor of the village of Red Hook was running a cider mill. So politics and booze are sort of
Very much intertwined.
Yeah. But so, you know, with a lot of booze, some bad things can happen. Right? And this is before Prohibition. Patrick Moray is standing on the front steps of his hotel on Independence Day. And he's just sort of surveying the scene when there's a
What
bit of
time of day is this?
This is about midnight. Right, so he's just sort of standing out there, maybe petting a cat, and so across the street in what is now the corner, a very nice establishment, the bartender there is a little bit drunk. And,
Just a little?
well, you be the judge. So he's a little drunk and the patrons are a little obstreperous and they're lighting off fireworks in the bar room. And he says, well, I'm gonna clean this up. So he takes his shotgun from behind the bar and he fires it. And Moray, standing across the street, gets shot in the face. He was fine. Fine enough that when it came time to go down to Poughkeepsie to go to court, the two of them rode together. And Moray said, you know, I don't want to press charges because he didn't mean to shoot me. I mean, he was just trying to clean up the bar. And so the assailant ended up getting a $25 fine and a 6-month suspended sentence. So it seems as though there would be reason to support.
But what did the judge tell him not to do?
Well, the judge did say that the assailant should not, his sentence would be enforced if he were to drink again because he was well known to be a menace to the villagers and property when he was drinking.
But did they take away his license?
No, absolutely not.
So that's great. Put a guy with a drinking problem in charge of a bar, but tell him not to drink.
Right.
That's a winning solution.
So here we go.
All right, I'll take over for a little bit here. So this is straight from the Poughkeepsie Eagle News, now the Poughkeepsie Journal. 1919, November, I want to say 3rd, but Election Day 1919, they pass the 18th Amendment at long last. And so they're theoretically, all consumption of sale of booze becomes illegal on January 1st, 1920, but this article, if I recall, is around January 20th of 1920, and it's announcing all of the measures that are going to be done. Now, at least before I began this project, and you guys nod if this sounds about right, everything I knew about Prohibition came more or less from the Eliot Ness stories and whatnot of, oh, they're going to come in and they're going to raid, they're going to knock things down, and just busting barrels and seizing everything from everywhere. Well, it turns out that the legislation was not actually that strict, and it included a bunch of loopholes. So officially, what was outlawed was the production of liquor for sale, the consumption of liquor outside of your home, and the sale of liquor. So some of the major loopholes that were being exploited throughout Prohibition, and it's pretty evident from 1920 on. The first thing is Okay, well, what about all of your medicinal items, for example, your medical treatments that contain liquor, for example, your patent medicine, which back before Prohibition is maybe 0.01% alcohol. Well, that's not officially covered by the Volstead Act or the 18th Amendment. So suddenly you see the percentage of alcohol increasing steadily in your patent medicine. Another issue is if you stockpiled a bunch of liquor before the 18th Amendment came into effect, they can't take it. And they actually said in this article that we will not be searching private homes. The only reason we will go into a private home is if we believe that it's essentially being used as a drinking resort. If folks are coming there to drink or if they're buying drink from there. But, you know, if you have a stash of liquor that you bought on December 30th, 1919, perfectly legal for you to drink that. Perfectly legal for your friends to come over for a dinner party and drink that. It's also perfectly legal if you're a hotel and you stocked up to serve that to people who are staying there. And we know not necessarily here in Red Hook, but in other places, the practice was that you just increase the charge for a dinner meal. And oh, your meal comes with a glass of wine gratis. The other part that's a little tricky, and the Prohibition agents more or less throw this to the wind, is home production for home consumption. So if you are an Italian immigrant, we saw this out in Millbrook, or a German, if you're Italian, you might be used to making wine at home. If you're German, you might be used to brewing beer at home. That's perfectly legal as long as you brew it and consume it on premises, without, again, opening your doors to everyone and everything, or trying to sell it. And of course, sacramental wine is also not touched, and the alcohol content there also tends to go up as Prohibition continues. And in fact, one of the classic lines from this article is that they say that cider mills and grape juice plants have been working overtime in New York State, with the price of apples and grapes going up, because sale of hard cider and grape juice with a kick in them, of course, are now taboo. Yeah, like that's actually going to stick. The other interesting part of this article is that it gives you an idea, again, these statistics aren't verified, but they're what were in circulation at the time, of the economic impact of Prohibition, because the wets have not given up. No, Prohibition's been passed, that's fine, but every act that has been passed can be overruled, it can be retracted, constitutional amendments can be altered down the way by new constitutional amendments, so they're not giving up the fight. And as Emily mentioned, one of the interesting things is the Democrats, you know, sometimes they're involved in this stuff, but they're mostly the dry party. It's the Republicans who tend to fall in line behind the wet platform. But this article says that the new amendment puts 236 distillers, 1,092 breweries, and 177,790 saloons out of business in the continental U.S., so the lower 48 states. Which, if anything, I would tend to think is probably on the low side of the estimation. And did you want to talk about what the article also said, or these guys come in?
I think this is part of the economic impact, right? Like you're putting all these bartenders out of work, and what are they going to do? So the article goes on to say that, you know, they're finding jobs in soda fountains, and I love the look on these guys' faces, because they are so not going to be making ice cream sundaes.
Yeah, they claim that most saloon owners have transformed their operations into restaurants and candy stores. Imagine little kids coming in to see these guys. The distillers were switching to making denatured alcohol for fuel and mechanical applications. Yeah. The breweries were going to switch to being malt sugar factories, because that's close enough. And that the wets were still going to fight on.
And there were speakeasies.
Oh, we're about to get to that. In fact,
Are we about to get to that?
are we about to get to that? I think we are about to get to that. In May 1920, well, first what we're going to hit is, and this actually speaks to it, is the locals continuing to do what the locals have been doing. So as Emily mentioned, and I'm going to get her to jump in here in a few minutes, cider's a big deal in Northern Dutchess. Those of you who are Northern Dutchess born and bred know that apples have been the thing here since the 18th century. Do you think they're going to stop producing cider? There's also the other side of that coin. Just because you're producing cider doesn't mean it's alcoholic. So what we have is, for example, on Saturday, May 27th, 1922, the Poughkeepsie Eagle News headline says that 10 barrels of liquor seized in a Red Hook raid. By sample of Vosburg, arrest him. Search and seizure warrants were executed. Great headlines during that period. So what had happened is there was a resident here in the village, maybe some of you remember him, of Edgar Vosburg. And deputies came in, this was the sheriffs, not the feds. The sheriffs come in and raid him, seizing 8 barrels of cider and 2 barrels of wine. Now Vosburg had already been pretty well locally known because in the preceding months his much, much younger wife had filed for separation, which back in 1922 was a pretty major thing to have happen. But they had known that his operation was going on because of sworn affidavits that were delivered to the to the district attorney, including one fellow who said, yeah, I went down to Vosburg's place, I bought a keg of cider, took it home, this was last Sunday, then on Tuesday I went down and personally witnessed him, drawing off a tap from a cider barrel in his basement. So here are the warning signs that Vosburg should have recognized. First, Dutchess County Sheriff C. Fred Close stops by one day and buys a couple of bottles of home brew. I would be slightly concerned if I was running an illegal liquor speakeasy and Butch Anderson showed up and said, can I get a couple of bottles? So Fred takes this down to Poughkeepsie, has it tested. The alcohol content is 5%. The legal top level is 0.05%. That's the topmost that say those patent medicines can hit. So then to make matters worse, before the full raiding party arrives, a deputy sheriff and one of their associates, he's an unnamed civilian, a witness, go in and buy a couple of pints right there from Vosburg and then signal the rest of the party to roll in. And they say that when they get in there, there are already 10 customers in this guy's house. So as you can see, it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. This is probably a guy who was involved in the cider trade, or at least the consumption thereof. Maybe he purchased all of this stuff before the curtain fell in 1920, but now he's switched over to selling it to all of his neighbors.
Well, and also, as much as this was going on, sort of out in the open, there were people who were quite upset about it. And so there's this article to the paper that says, there's a letter to the editor saying, what of the homebrew violators, 3 of whom are on Montgomery Street and 1 on Faro Avenue? Are not the intoxicated men and children roaming our streets evidence enough to warrant an investigation? Have not the evidence of the facts been proclaimed from the pulpits of one of our prominent churches? There are none so blind as those who do not want to see.
My favorite part about that is the intoxicated children who are roaming the streets.
Absolutely, urchins.
Because you've seen a 6-year-old who's just drunk, right? I've not seen that. I'm hoping they're referring to teenagers. It's a little unsettling.
But it seems too that really they have to go above the local constabulary level in order to, because they're saying here, if you want to stop it, get an outside officer.
Yeah, because the president of the village of Tivoli is in the business. The president of the village here in Red Hook is in the business. Everyone basically is involved in the liquor flowing, so why would you think that you could go to locals? As that article actually says, why would you complain to the people who are behind this business? But I'm actually going to turn this one over to Emily because she loves it so much. But how many of you are familiar with St. Stephen's College? What is that today? Audience participation. Bard College. So you have here in 1926, Prohibition has now been enforced for 6 years. This is Dr. Bernard Idings Bell, president of St. Stephen's College, weighing in on what alcohol has done to the students So Emily,
Yeah, all right. So, before the Prohibition law, there was a saloon in Annandale run by a gentleman of considerable repute. Today, I know of 6 places where you can purchase bad liquor within a radius of 2 miles of the college. In Red Hook, there were 3 saloons, not as well handled as they ought to be, but still very much better than at present. Anybody can buy a bad grade of liquor at not a very exorbitant price in the speakeasies along the state road. I should say that there was more opportunity for buying liquor than before Prohibition. I wish that I could tell you a more encouraging tale. Not only do we have to deal with a group which has been taught through the Prohibition laws to despise the law of the land, but we have to deal with a group which gets that bad liquor easily. So,
yeah, it's not good. And he further said, and those are direct quotes from his letter to the district attorney. And he says, I've been here for 25 years, and in that time I saw a steady increase in the quality of the conduct of the students right up until Prohibition. And as soon as Prohibition starts, the bottom falls out, and now it's frat life all over the place. He actually mentions the fraternities as major culprits behind this.
I thought actually he was talking about the fraternities having improved the behavior in the time before Prohibition, like exerting a positive influence.
Fraternities exerting positive influence. This must have been the pre-Animal House. Yeah.
Literary fraternities.
Literary fraternities?
Yes.
All right, so the traffic problems. You think it's bad today? Emily, do you want to jump on this,
We
or
can talk about this a little bit.
more generally? And
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of increased traffic and accidents as a result of it, and speeding trucks that are loaded, more than they should be with hidden contraband. So one of the articles speaks about how the brakes on these trucks frequently give out because they shouldn't be, carrying however many gallons of.
or go as fast as they were. That same article actually quotes that a fellow started from Madeline, right outside of the village of Tivoli, and made it to New York City in 2.5 hours, which in the 30s, when Route 9 is still under construction, is pretty good. Today it's pretty good. But that he was passed by farmers' trucks along the way. Yeah, they are blamed for all sorts of problems. In fact, one of those headlines was about the Poughkeepsie Automobile Association actually saying we are going to start campaigning at the state level to get new traffic regulations passed to expand the number of state troopers who are able to police this, because people are dying left, right, and center. If you go through the papers of that period, a lot of what you see from Northern Dutchess are traffic accident reports, much more so than in any other part of the county, because they start up here and there's not a whole lot between them and Poughkeepsie, and they just let it fly. And of course, the very polite writer of that article was saying, "Oh, it's probably just too many grapes," or products of grapes. But we have a couple of other interesting hits here before we explain this photograph, which is maybe not what you think it is. But for example, in April of 1927, there was a trooper barracks at the time that was pretty close to the village of Red Hook off Route 9. And there was a motorcycle trooper who happened to see a truck going by up Route 9 from Poughkeepsie to, well, it turned out the destination was going to be Hudson. He's looking at this van, and it's got a very small corporate logo company name on the side, and he thinks, there's not enough writing on that van. I bet it's carrying beer, which I guess that's a commentary on advertising on vehicles of the period. So he pulls out a motorcycle, jumps on it, pursues this van 4 miles right into the middle of the village of Red Hook, so right down the street here, pulls the guy over. And this was the 5th, essentially they're calling them raids on automobiles that had been made that month by the troopers. And he states that once he gets the back of this truck open, they find, sure I have the number down here somewhere, 51 kegs of beer that was being transported from Poughkeepsie up to Hudson for sale. And initially the driver said, I don't know what's in the back. Van showed up in Poughkeepsie, yeah, it was chicken. Van showed up in Poughkeepsie, I was told drive it to Hudson, and Trooper's like, really? Is that the best you can do? It's like, oh, okay, yeah, there's a bunch of beer in the back. And then we've got other chase stories here that you can see some of the headlines of, but it's all up and down with the troopers and sometimes the feds just stopping everything from vans and trucks to individual cars. There was a car that was stopped here, a sedan on the way to Hudson, and they found something like 30-odd half kegs of beer just stuck away in it. But this point, I think, really speaks to the organized crime element. So, Emily, what?
That is a surveillance photograph of 2 decommissioned German subs taken off Curtin Point, and I believe it was 1924. And they are moving booze.
Yeah, these are World War I German surplus that are being used to transport booze up the Hudson River.
So it's everything, so you've got farmers, you've got wagons full of hay, and they're shoving bottles of Applejack into that and taking them down to the, right on up to this. And this is just to sort of show, this is a basement saloon in Tivoli. And although, the business may have been literally and figuratively driven underground, in the paper, the commentary is that people are riding their bicycles on the sidewalk and ignoring the laws much as they ignore the Volstead Act. Okay. So it's
not a lot of
correlation, not a lot of respect there.
Not at all. And to give you an idea of the sorts of places that were supplying these speakeasies, we've got a couple of really classic raids here in Red Hook. The first of these is in April of 1927, and it's the Red Hook Steam Cider Works, which was a legitimate business that was involved in making non-alcoholic cider. Now, of course, do they put all the chemicals in there to stop it from turning alcoholic with age? We won't know, because the real issue was its manager, Thomas McGrath, he had an interesting situation on his farm. 2 barns that were joined together. And federal agents, this again, we're moving towards federal enforcement more than local, raided this barn in April of 1927, where they found 2 150-gallon stills, so full capacity of 350 gallons, in perfect working order, 40 barrels of Applejack and hard cider on site, and a cider press with 5 vats. Each of those vats was capable of holding 28,000 gallons of cider to press it out. Now, when he was called on it, McGrath said, "Oh, the vats, that's for making apple cider vinegar." And of course, he wasn't on the scene, and this is often what we see, is that the folks who are responsible are not caught on the scene. Instead, he had a fellow, Charles Best, an employee who was caught out there when the agents arrived. And as the article states, the stills were in operation when the agents arrived. They at once knocked out the heads of a number of kegs containing alleged Applejack after obtaining samples, and dumped the liquor in back of the barns. Hundreds of gallons of cider were spoiled by pouring gasoline into the barrels. I wouldn't want to drink that afterwards. The contents of the huge storage vats were not touched, because you can't necessarily make that part of the story stick. You have a large number of raids that are conducted on local folks, which there's one that actually occurs here, and these are identified as pretty small-time operators. So in February of 1928, then Under Sheriff Seafred Close and 2 federal agents come here, again, to the middle of the village of Red Hook. There's a lot of stuff going on in the village of Red Hook in an illegal fashion. They arrest Archie Holden because they went into his barn and found a 50-gallon still and a small quantity of alleged liquor. And they'd apparently had him under observation for quite some time before they did this. And then there's one more that really speaks to the level of essentially what's almost a professional distilling business in Northern Dutchess by that time. This is June 14th, 1929. The headline is, "Federal Squad Seizes Still. Upper Red Hook Man Held for Court. Found on Farm. Distilling Plant Was in Operation."
So federal agents from Kingston, a lot of Kingston office activity up here, arrested Dominic Banura of Upper Red Hook after discovering a still on his farm, threw him in Ulster County Jail. Didn't really trust the Dutchess County people to keep an eye on him. And they found a 1,000-gallon still in operation in a barn immediately adjacent to the farmhouse. So they're not even trying to hide this on the back 40. And Banura told them, as they say, this is a quote, told the usual story of being merely a caretaker and that he did not know the still was in the barn. They didn't really believe this, but on the other hand, this is one of those situations that could very easily be organized crime coming up from New York City saying, here's a couple of $1,000s in cash, we'd like to do something with your barn, do you have any questions? And if you're a farmer at that point in time, you probably won't have any questions, and you'll keep your nose clean. But the end of the article I thought was very instructive. It said that federal prohibition men have been especially active recently and have visited several places in Dutchess County. Their last visit to the county was 3 weeks ago when they arrested 7 proprietors of alleged liquor dispensing establishments. And then the final takeaway is that this still was, to quote, as stills are considered, it was only a small one, as some of them go as high as 5,000-gallon capacity and others even more. So again, this is professional level distilling, employing people who were distillers before Prohibition came into effect. And I think we're going to end today with really a tale that may caution you against visiting Poughkeepsie, because Red Hook folks down in Poughkeepsie, it's not a good scene for you guys. So this comes from the Poughkeepsie Eagle News of Tuesday, August 24th, 1931. Fred Jacoby, which I'm told Jacoby is a well-known name in the area, 56 of Red Hook had been visiting Poughkeepsie the previous day, so that would have been August 23rd, 1931. He's walking down Cannon Street, which if you've ever been to Poughkeepsie, you know T intersections into Market Street. So he's out for an exercise walk. He gets to 76 Cannon Street, and there's a garage there. The doors are open. There's a large, hefty fellow sitting inside, and the fellow says, "Hey, come in." And Jacoby says, No, thanks, I'm out for an exercise walk." And to quote, the man replied, "I'm a cowpuncher. I've only been here 3 days, and I'm already wanted by the police." So with that rather intimidating statement, Jacoby decides to walk into the garage instead of running away, which, yeah, I would have chosen the running option myself. The guy offers Jacoby a beer. It's like, well, it's 1931, Prohibition's in full swing. No thanks, that'd be illegal. To which the cowpuncher said, "Drink it or I'll shoot you full of holes." So Jacoby has his beer, and then the cowpuncher locks him in the garage, puts a padlock on the outside. Jacoby manages to escape through a small window in the back, gets to the city police. They send a detective and a patrol officer there who check out the scene. It's everything that Jacoby has described. So this isn't like some weird fanciful dream. They couldn't at that point in time figure out who owned the garage. But again, if you do go to visit Poughkeepsie and a cowpuncher in a garage invites you in, I wouldn't recommend
So is
going in there.
cowpuncher like euphemistic for like psychopath?
I guess cowpuncher is euphemistic for psychopath. I mean, who else punches cows? He might have meant it literally at that point. So that is our program for this evening, unless you have anything else to add. Thank you all for joining us. Emily and I will be around to answer any questions, and enjoy the rest of your evening here in Red Hook.
Huh?